Welcome back to, I was going to say welcome back to Florida, but welcome back to Florida. Voter rights advocates are up in arms over new restrictions put in place in Florida that they say will lead to significant drop-offs in new voter registrations. Among other things, the new law dramatically narrows the window that third-party groups are given to submit completed voter registration forms without facing a fine, that is. Before the law, they had 10 days. Now we have 48 hours to bring those forms back in. Groups like the League of Women Voters and Rock the Vote have outright suspended their voting registration efforts down in Florida. What's been the consequence? Well, the New York Times looked at the number of new voters registered since the law was put into place and compared it to the same period before the 2008 election. They found nearly 81,500 fewer Floridians were registered to vote this time. So does the law go too far? Leonard Curry is the chair of the Florida Republican Party. Thank you for joining us. And Judith Browne. Dianis is the co-director of the Advancement Project, a voter rights organization. I want to ask you, Mr. Curry, right off the bat, do you think it's good for America that we have fewer people voting? It seems like these new rules have had one effect, to reduce the number of Florida voters. Isn't that itself a prima facie case? You're getting a little tough down there on the process of registering, doing what you have a right to do, vote.
We want people to vote. Look, I come from a business background. I was in the jobs business, staffing and executive recruiting. And in my company, we had a governance program in place that made sure that there were no errors, there were no omissions, and there were omissions, no mistakes, and no fraud. And that would be unacceptable in voting. So that's simply what this law does. It's good governance.
Okay, let me ask Judith to get the back and forth on this. 48 hours now to bring in a form. I've grown up, during the Vietnam War period. You had people out in front of Safeways. You signed up to vote.
That's right.
Now, under this new law, you have to have that form in within 2 days. And if you don't, you pay a $10,000 fine in Florida, which means if you register somebody at this what is it?
It's
$50. Why did I hear
$50? It's $50 for the first few applications, and then it goes up to $10,000.
Oh, it's up to $10,000. Well, let me get to the point here. If you don't turn it in on time, you get fined. I would certainly discourage people from picking up on the job of registering voters if you can't get it in 2 days. By the way, Saturday, when you get it in.
That's right.
Sunday night?
Right. You can imagine volunteers who are volunteering for the League of Women Voters, who's been doing voter registration for about 75 years in Florida, saying we don't want to be subject to those kinds of fines just because we didn't turn it in. And literally, they're counting it down to the minute. And really what we need to do is think about how this fits into the larger context of voter suppression that's been carried out by the GOP this year.
Can Mr. Curry respond to that? Is it reasonable to expect a person to show up within 48 hours with registration forms that they just had filled out, say, over a weekend?
Absolutely. Again, it's good governance. Before this law, any group could go out anywhere, register voters, sit on those voter registration forms for unlimited amount of time. The individual that registered to vote would have no idea whether or not, A, their voter registration was submitted, and if the right party was submitted. So this comes back to, it's just good governance to make sure that people that register to vote know that their vote's there and they can go vote and that their vote will count.
Well, it still seems to be a problem that if you have 48 hours to get something in just mechanically, say it's 10 o'clock Saturday morning in front of a Safeway, you got the person's signature down, you're ready to register. If you don't show up by Monday morning at 10, right?
Right. Right.
You got a fine facing it.
Right. And the story in the New York Times highlighted the NAACP being hit by this and getting a letter from the Secretary of State. And that was over the weekend of the Martin Luther King's birthday. But again, it's important to put this in a context. Not only did the Republican Party in Florida roll back in terms of voter registration, they also cut back on early voting. And so this is part of the bigger scheme of what's happening across the country.
Okay, let's go to that. Mr. Curry, why is it important to reduce the number of days you can early vote from 14 to 8? How does that reduce corruption or in any way take away from the integrity of the process?
Well, a couple of things. Republicans are, in fact, the ones in Florida that gave us early voting. The Democrats, when they had control, did nothing to make voting easier. The other thing is that the
respond to my question. Why is it important to close the window of opportunity to vote?
The supervisors of elections, Republicans and Democrats, have said that Sunday before the Tuesday election that they need adequate time to get ready for Tuesday. That's the feedback that the legislature got in crafting this law.
Isn't it true that a lot of African Americans go to register to vote on Sunday after going to church? And that's a pattern that the Republican Party would like to squash.
I don't want to see
partisan concern.
It's called "Take Your Souls to the Polls." That last
explain
Sunday,
how it works.
On that last Sunday before Election Day, black churches throughout the state of Florida had a campaign where they would go in caravan to the polling place after church. It is that one Sunday that was cut out by the Florida legislature, which again targets these laws. We have to understand impact black and Latino voters and young voters, those who turned out in record numbers in 2008. And now they've rolled it back so that it's cutting off that participation of that group.
Do you think your party had any role in that decision to try to get rid of that Sunday voting opportunity, Mr. Curry?
The supervisor of elections, again, from both parties, indicated that they needed the time 2 days before that Tuesday. Look, I want to see everybody that's registered to vote given the opportunity to vote. There's plenty of time and plenty of opportunity to vote.
But
and
you
Chris,
just cut down. Let me go back to your point. You didn't answer my question, sir, and I don't want to grill you here except to ask an obvious question. Everybody watching can hear me ask. You had an opportunity under the law before that you had 14 days for early voting down there. And we all know the pattern of early voting has changed over the years. It used to be used for people who had money and traveled a lot. And then Republicans benefited from that. Later on, when minorities began to vote early because they had transportation challenges facing them, and we all know that, they can't just get in the car in many cases. They need help to do it. And they needed that opportunity, that 2-week window. The minute your party saw this benefiting the Democrats, you got rid of what was an opportunity for vacationing and well-traveled Republicans, wealthy people. Why did you change the law? Simply because Democratic voters were starting to utilize it, the 14-day opportunity.
I just don't buy that premise, Chris.
Well, why'd you reduce the window of opportunity to voting?
I don't think
you said a minute ago that you like to have more people voting. Then why'd you close the window?
I just explained why on that Sunday.
No, why the 2 weeks? Why reducing from 14 to 8? This other matter of
and election officials, I have to say, election officials do not like that part of reducing the number of hours because, in fact, a number of days because they now have to pay overtime to people. So this is really about this partisan effort. It's nothing but that.
Okay, I only want to get one answer. You said you want increased amount of voting in your state. I'm sure you believe in that in principle. My question to you is why in practice are you reducing the number of days from 14 to 8 for early voting?
If you look at the law requires the total hours that the offices have to be open for early voting are the same. It gives different counties flexibility in terms of what those hours are. So actual total hour access to voting is exactly the same. There's no change. And Chris, I know you really don't believe that we want to suppress minorities from voting.
Well, I'm trying to find out because the trouble is, Mr. Curry, I look at the pattern in every state legislature, and inevitably it's Republicans who want to reduce the opportunity to vote in every state. It's always the same pattern. And I'll throw it back at you for a quick response. Why is it your party that always wants to raise the barrier to voting consistently across the country in this particular period of time? Maybe not 20 years ago, but right now you want to make it harder for poor people, harder for minorities to vote. Why is that?
I just don't buy that premise. We want good governance. We want to make sure that people, every vote counts and that people are properly registered.
I think Abraham Lincoln agreed with that principle, and I thank you for coming on. We're going to continue arguing this because this is always an issue. Judith, thank you. Judith Browne, Dianis, and Leonard Curry. Thank you, sir, for coming in, chairman of the Republican Party in Florida.